Hi guys, going to talk today about adjusting your diet to match your training and how you manipulate diet to get the best results from your training to reach your specific goals at any one time. So we can probably break your goals down into one or two things, either building muscle or dropping body fat. Now with that said, there is actually a third type of training that you will want to consider to get you towards those goals. So obviously we've got a mass gain phase and a cutting phase, but the third phase you want to consider is a maintenance phase. So a maintenance phase, you're actually trying to hold your weight steady and maintain your muscle mass without looking to gain any significant amount of body fat or muscle mass. It might seem a bit weird, why do you want to maintain? Well, actually it's a great way to hold on to the muscle you've built at the end of a mass gain phase and then prepare yourself for the diet, or after you've dieted, maintain and get that new low body fat set point before going into a mass gain phase, and doing so will limit the amount of fat you'll accumulate as you transition from a cut to a bulk. Anyway, if you've got those three phases, your training within each phase is going to be slightly different, and therefore your nutrition should mirror the differences in training and best support them. So the mass gain phase, you've got to ask yourself, what's the goal? Well, obviously it's to increase mass, to increase muscle size, and you want to build as much muscle as possible in this phase of training. So what sort of training best achieves that? Well, it's high volume weight training, mostly in the 6 to 12 rep range, and you'll be training, pretty frequently across the week, 4, 5, 6 days a week, and working with really high volumes. So what nutrition best supports that type of training? Well, number one, if you want to build muscle, you need to be in a surplus. You need to be taking on more calories than you're burning. And number two, carbohydrates best support high volume weight training because they're the dominant source of energy for the central nervous system and athletic activities. So they really help to fuel grueling training sessions and help you recover and replenish glycogen after training. And the stored glycogen that your body stores from the carbohydrates you ingest is the preferential source of energy during training, and probably 80% of your energy expenditure during weight training comes from carbs or that stored glycogen. So you want to be taking on plenty of carbohydrates to support that and allow you to train with as high a volume as possible to build as much muscle as possible. So to establish what your surplus is, or your total calories you need to be eating, you need to eat enough to be able to gain about 0.25 to 0.5% of your body weight per week. So if you're 200 pounds, that equates to about half a pound to a pound a week. Or in kilos, that's 0.25 to 0.5 of a kilo a week. And so to achieve that kind of rate of weight gain equates to roughly a 250 to 500 calorie surplus per day over your maintenance values. Now, to establish maintenance, the best thing to do is monitor your scale weight over a period of time. I'd say at least 5 days, ideally up to 2 weeks, to get a really, really good insight, and then make adjustments based on that. So if you track your food for 5 days and weigh yourself every day and your weight hasn't changed, you've been eating on at maintenance. So if you average out the calories you've consumed over those 5 days, the average is what you need to maintain your weight. And from there, you'll need to give yourself a 250 to 500 calorie a day surplus to get you building muscle at the rate we've outlined. Now, make adjustments as you go based on your results. So if you're not gaining weight quickly enough, then you should increase calories by 250 to 500 calories a day. If you're a really big guy, at the higher end of that spectrum. If you're smaller, maybe at the lower end of that spectrum. And then you need to work out your protein, fat and carbohydrate needs that goes into that total calorie allowance. Now, protein is of primary importance. It's the first one to set, but it doesn't mean it's the most important to eat a lot of. You just need to eat enough to max out your muscle protein synthesis over the course of a day. And 1 gram per kilo will achieve that. So if you eat 1 gram per kilo of body weight per day of protein, that's fine. Next, we set fat. Now, fat we just need enough to support optimal hormonal function. And given you're in a surplus and that carbs also support hormonal function, the amount of fat you need is actually not that high. Probably 0.6 of a gram per kilo will be sufficient. And then the rest comes from carbs, and I'd say that needs to be at least a minimum of 3 grams per kilo per day. So Once you've established your total calories, you then put those protein and fat numbers in, 1 gram per kilo and zero point 0.6 grams per kilo respectively, and fill the rest up with carbs. That might mean you're having a lot of carbohydrates. So for example, in the end of my last phase, mass gain phase, I was having almost 700 grams of carbohydrate a day. Now, that ends up being quite an extremely high carb, moderate protein and low fat diet. Now, a maintenance phase, also known as a transition or primer phase, is basically, as I outlined earlier, when you're trying to maintain your muscle mass and act as a transition to the next phase of training, whether that be going into another mass gain phase or transitioning into a cut. The training that best achieves this is strength training, because you're only looking to maintain muscle mass, not build more. You can train with a lower frequency, use a lower volume, use low reps. For example, like 3 sets of 5 is a great thing to use when you're in a maintenance phase, because it's much easier to maintain muscle than it is to build. So the stimulus you need from training can be much lower. You know, in a mass gain phase, you might be needing to smash lots of sets and reps to signal to your body to build muscle. You're just looking to maintain what you've already built here, and that's achievable in much lower volume. The nutrition to achieve maintenance is really simple. It's isocaloric, enough to maintain your body weight. You just need to eat at maintenance. So whatever amount of food that means your body weight stays stable across the phase is perfect. So in a bit more detail with the nutrition, because at maintenance you're training heavy but with much lower volume, there's still, and you're maintaining your body weight, the risk of muscle loss is very low. Again, the chances of you building a lot of muscle is quite low, but in this phase we're trying to maintain. Because of that, protein can stay, just needs to be enough to max out muscle protein synthesis, much like it was in the mass gain phase, so 1 gram per kilo is fine. Carbs can be reduced down because your training volume is much lower, so you don't need so many to recover and to fuel the training. And actually, I'd say fats can be increased somewhat because those carbs have come down. You're no longer in a surplus, so the risk of hormonal disruption is slightly increased, and it gives you a chance to recover some insulin sensitivity that you may have lost at the end of your mass gain phase. Because if you're always chucking in loads of carbohydrates, your body's pumping out loads of insulin to deal with that. Then you can become somewhat insulin resistant, which is not where we want to be at all. So by bringing those carbs down and bumping the fats up, it allows you to regain some insulin sensitivity. Also, it provides a nice psychological relief, because at the end of a long massing phase where you've been eating tons and tons of carbs and on a quite low fat diet, it means you're probably sick of the sight of foods like rice, potatoes, oats, especially when they're paired with lean proteins. So as a result, in a maintenance phase, you actually have the opportunity to eat some sort of fattier foods with still having a reasonable amount of carbohydrates. So it actually gives you a bit potential for some the opportunity to eat some really tasty food, and it washes away any sort of that dieting fatigue. Even though you're trying to build muscle and you weren't in a deficit, it still can become a bit boring eating really high carb and lean protein sources all the time. And so this means psychologically you get a bit of a break from that. Peanut butter's back in the mix, or some of that really tasty food. Anything that combines some fat and carbs usually tastes pretty amazing, so you can get that stuff in. And then doing that eases the psychological burden that you may have accumulated, and it really sets you up for the next phase of training, whether that be going into another mass gain phase or dieting. And that's hugely important in dieting, because when you're dieting, psychologically also you're always hungry, but if you've been able to wash away any of that sort of fatigue and boredom of you're eating for the mass gain phase and have some really tasty stuff, sets you up well. You're not, even though dieting might be a bit restrictive, you're more likely to embrace it. So to conclude the maintenance phase, protein at about 1 gram per kilo. I then set carbs at 3 grams a kilo, which is probably probably wherever about half of the peak of your mass gain phase was. So for me, I was having 700 grams right at the end of my mass gain phase. I'd have about 350 grams in a maintenance phase. And then fat is the rest. And that's probably somewhere in the ballpark of 1.25 to 1.5 kilos per kilo of body weight. Sorry, 1.25 to 1.5 grams per kilo of body weight. Otherwise you'd be in, non-stop, just washing yourself in peanut butter if you're trying to eat a kilo per kilo. Sounds pretty good. Right, cutting phase. So the goal of a cutting phase is obviously to drop body fat. So what sort of training best achieves that? Well, actually, still quite a high volume of training. So training will, in many respects, be very similar to a mass gain phase, but it's only as much training as you can handle and recover from. And because you're in a deficit with your nutrition, you won't be able to handle quite as much as you can in mass gain. And you may even be using some things like some cardio to help you drop some body fat. So the nutrition to support fat loss, number one, a deficit, so consuming fewer calories than you burn. Two, make sure protein's a sufficient amount to maintain muscle mass. Now, this might be slightly higher than it was in a maintenance or a mass gain phase, but not much. And then carbs, we still want to keep them as high as possible to support high training volumes to allow you to burn lots of calories and keep you losing fat. But the risk of hormonal disruption is higher because you're in a deficit. So you've got to consider the fat intake with this. So fat intake is going to be a bit higher than it is in mass gain phases, probably a gram per kilo of body weight. And as a result, carbs will have to be lower than a mass gain phase because you're consuming more fats and you're also in a deficit. So you might end up with 1 to 1.2 grams per kilo of body weight coming from protein, a gram per kilo from fat, and then the rest from carbs. Whatever that may be for you in terms of your total calories. And I would suggest that you try and maintain at least 2 grams per kilo of body weight of carbs for as long as possible to allow for productive overloading training. You might, if you're trying to get really, really super lean, you might have to go below that towards the end, but as long as possible, try and keep the carbs there to fuel decent training, because when you're in a deficit, the risk of muscle loss increases, and you want to be able to do some good training to provide that stimulus to the body to say, no, we're going to hang on to the muscle and we're just going to lose fat. If your training goes down the pan and you can't train hard, then you're not able to provide that stimulus. So give yourself enough carbs to support that. Okay, so that should give you an overview of how you can manipulate your training and your diet together and how they should marry up to get you progressing towards your goals. If you've got any questions or anything needs clearing up, then let me know. Drop me a comment below, I'll try and get back to you, or maybe I'll need to do a different video of looking at some of the details of certain elements if there's anything particularly you want me to cover. Until then, happy training.